Welcome everybody. Today's reading, chapter 32, would be quite a good one for Christmas Day. It's called Unto Us a Child is Born. It's obvious the moment we look at the Gospels that their writers didn't set out to write lives of Jesus in the modern sense. There's no day-to-day or even year-to-year account of what happened. Nothing is said of what Jesus looked like, whether he was tall or short, dark or fair, bearded or clean-shaven. Any paintings that have ever been made of him are pure guesswork. It's not certain exactly when he was born, how long his public ministry lasted, or in what year he died. All that is recorded of his teaching would fill no more than a page or two of a newspaper, and we're told nothing of his conversation about everyday affairs. Clearly, the authors of the four Gospels were not writing biography as we understand the word now. The name given to his book by the writer of the earliest narrative about Jesus, St. Mark, gives us the clue to what he and his fellow evangelists were about. He calls it not a life of Jesus, but a gospel. This is an old Anglo-Saxon word meaning God's story or the good story, and it was used in the English version of the Scriptures to translate the word which Mark uses, and which means good news. This then was what all four writers were bent on doing, giving an account of the good news of what God had done for the world through Jesus Christ. This is why they do not linger over what they would have called tittle-tattle about Jesus' boyhood days, details of his personal tastes and mannerisms, all of which we should, of course, dearly love to know. They believed that they were writing of things far more important, nothing less than God's greatest act for the salvation of the world. It's significant that in Mark's 16 short chapters, about half of them are taken up with the events that led up to Jesus' death and resurrection. In short, right from the outset of any record of Jesus at all, of what he did and what he said, there's the basic conviction that this is no ordinary life of a great teacher or rabbi or prophet, but an account of a unique person who, although quite obviously a man like other men, was in some strange way like no other man who ever lived. Later generations tried to express the enigma of Jesus in succinct terms, in creeds and confessions, and succeed as far as it is possible to express in words what is ultimately inexpressible. But as far as the Gospel writers were concerned, they were content to set down what they themselves had known or heard, and leave us to draw our own conclusions. They give us no tidy picture, which would answer all our questions. They give us rather a series of impressions, incidents and utterances, which taken together have fired men's imaginations, inspired their devotion, demanded their decision, and won their allegiance for well nigh 2,000 years. Perhaps it is just because in the providence of God it is such an imprecise record that men and women of all races, geographically, temporally and temperamentally, remote from first century Palestine, still find in the gospel story the answers to their deepest needs and their quest for meaning and purpose in a sometimes terrifying world. Oddly enough, Jesus must have been born before the Christian era, which is supposed to date from his birth. The monk who in the 6th century first reckoned when BC ended and AD began got his calculations wrong. Jesus must have been born before the death of Herod the Great, who died in 4 BC, and his birth was probably between 8 and 6 BC. Two of the four Gospels, Matthew and Luke, identify his birthplace as Bethlehem, where, as Luke tells us, Joseph and Mary were temporarily resident for registration during an imperial census, which was being taken for taxation purposes. Round the birth of Jesus in the stable of the inn at Bethlehem, where Joseph and Mary found makeshift accommodation, has grown a wealth of picturesque stories and customs reflected in the celebration of Christmas. Some of this is sheer fantasy and has no basis in the Gospel narrative. Yet, if the Gospels had not given us a solid foundation on which to build our Christmas festivities, the world would be a sadder and a gloomier place. No one, despite the commercialism and odd whiffs of paganism at Christmastide, would suggest that we should be better off without its message of peace and goodwill, or that because some people eat too much or drink too much, we should abolish an occasion which gives rise to so much happiness and friendliness. Yet, at the heart of it all, is the gospel claim that the child who was born in a stable and cradled in a manger was the Saviour of the world. We must not be deluded into thinking that because poetry and devotion have added their quota with angelic choirs and guiding stars, we are dealing with a fairy tale or a world of make-believe. The Jews had been expecting a Messiah for centuries. The appearance of a particularly brilliant star, such as might have been produced by a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in 7 BC, could have brought astrologers or wise men from Babylon to Palestine to investigate. Shepherds in the fields around Bethlehem may well have made their way to the traditional home of David, where the son of David might be expected to be born, moved by something less dramatic than an angelic announcement. But the homage paid to the infant Jesus by representatives of the learned world and of simple peasants, however much the stories may have been embroidered by the time they came into the hands of the gospel writers, brings us to the heart of the Christmas mystery, the virgin birth. All sorts of arguments, some of them quite sound, have been produced to show how this belief could have grown up for doctrinal reasons. It has been pointed out that it is mentioned nowhere else in the New Testament, outside the opening chapters of Matthew and Luke, and that the early church did not make belief in the virgin birth of Jesus a condition of becoming a Christian. Yet, when all is said and done, many of us, remembering all that Christ has meant for the world, will find it easier to think of the beginning of his life on earth as being no less unique than its ending. And we'll ask ourselves if it is more likely that the Saviour of the world was the son of two worthy Jewish villagers than that a special creative act of God brought into being a new type of man. Not long after the birth of Jesus, we're told that mad King Herod, alarmed at the rumours of the birth of the Messiah and fearful of a threat to his throne, ordered the massacre of all male children in Bethlehem under 2 years old. Jesus was taken by Joseph and Mary for safety to nearby Egypt, until, with the death of the old king, it was prudent to return. They settled at Nazareth in Galilee, where Joseph was the local carpenter. And apart from a visit to Jerusalem at the age of 12, when Jesus was found by his harassed family in the temple, earnestly questioning the rabbis, long after the rest of the party had begun the homeward journey to Nazareth, the curtain falls on him for the next 30 years. This, to us, extraordinary gap in the story has exercised the ingenuity of many minds from the earliest centuries of the Church's history. What people do not know, they often invent, and fantastic tales were conjured up of Jesus' boyhood prowess and feats of strength in young manhood in these hidden years. More recently, since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it has been suggested that he may have spent some of those years in the monastery at Qumran. It is unlikely that this happened, and there's not the slightest evidence to prove that it did. Nothing could be further removed from the attitude of the rigidly exclusive ascetics of the Dead Sea community, as we know them from their writings, than the warmly compassionate and social friend of all in need as we know Jesus from the pages of the Gospels. The four evangelists regard the real beginning of the story of Jesus as his entry into public life, as a preacher and a healer after his encounter with John the Baptist. But from the stories or parables that Jesus himself told, we can gather something of his life during these hidden years. Nazareth was a quiet village, lying among the hills of Galilee. The great caravan route from Asia to Africa bypassed it on the coastal plain. City life, apart from visits to Jerusalem, seems to have played little part in Jesus' early days. He was a countryman with a countryman's interests. When St. Paul looked for illustrations to make a point in his letters, he found them in the life of the Greek cities which he knew. Jesus, on the other hand, turned to the fields, the farms, the fisherfolk, and the simple country homes of Galilee to find his images. Joseph isn't mentioned during Jesus' public ministry, so it's reasonable to assume that he had died in the meantime, and that Jesus, as the eldest son, carried on the carpenter's shop. Other brothers and sisters mentioned in the Gospels may either have been younger than Jesus, or may have been children of Joseph by a previous marriage. It's thus in the uneventful life of an unimportant village, in a provincial backwater of the Roman Empire, that the stage was set for events that have turned the world upside down. Two things can be said with certainty. Firstly, that it was in Nazareth, in the normal life of a small community, that Jesus got to know ordinary men and women in all their strength and weakness. And secondly, that it was here that as a serious-minded young Jewish joiner, among all the chores and daily problems of his trade, he began to ask himself far-reaching questions. His knowledge of the Old Testament scriptures was profound, as we can see from his teaching. And to one who so clearly saw into the heart of Israel's faith at its best, it must have been a cause of growing discontent and dismay that the current orthodoxy of his time, no doubt fully represented in the services of the synagogue at Nazareth, was such a shallow travesty of Israel's great religious heritage. Accordingly, when news came to Nazareth that a prophet with an arresting message, like the powerful Old Testament spokesman of God, was drawing crowds to the Jordan's banks by announcing that the coming of the Messiah was at hand, and that something like a mass religious revival had begun, it's not surprising that Jesus took this as a sign that God was once again stirring up his people, and that he must hear it for himself. But there must have been a deeper reason than curiosity to make him forsake his home and his trade. It would not have needed even a hint from Mary, his mother, that there had been something strange in the manner of his birth to make this deeply thoughtful young man hold a continuing audit of his soul. Unless Jesus was an entirely different man during his public life from what he'd been in his quiet Galilean village, he must have become increasingly aware that his relationship with God was far more intimate than it seemed to be in the rest of his circle. The sense of living his life in the constant awareness of the presence of God must surely also have been matched with a growing sense of power. Power that must have been given to him to use in the service of God on a wider stage than Nazareth. So he made his way south, and he joined the crowds that thronged around the Baptist. John's words came to him as a personal call. Not indeed to return to a life of obedience to God, for he'd never known anything else, but to dedicate himself anew to God in baptism, to identify himself with those who responded to the Baptist summons, and to offer his own service on behalf of those who were indifferent to God's challenge. Jesus' baptism in the Jordan at the hands of John was a shattering experience. As he came out of its waters, it was as if the heavens opened, and as if God himself spoke to him. At that moment, his self-questioning was answered. He knew he was the Messiah. In turmoil of spirit, he went off into the solitude of the wild region around the Jordan to think this through. The picturesque stories of his temptations by the devil in the wilderness are the Bible's way of telling us, as Jesus himself must later have confided his experience at this time to his disciples, how he rejected one possible course after another. What sort of Messiah was he going to be? How was he to use this increased sense of power that had come to him at his baptism? Was it given to him to create the kind of material paradise that many were looking for? Or to startle men into faith with spectacular supernatural displays? Or, as most people wanted, was he to set himself up as a new Judas Maccabeus and raise the flag of revolt against the Romans? Jesus came back from his solitary agonizing over his problem with his mind made up. As God's Messiah, he must take no shortcuts to success and offer no second bests. The path he had finally chosen was far harder, but he believed that it was the path God wanted him to follow.